King David may have convinced himself that he had dodged the bullet. He may have thought that he had escaped unscathed. He may have even thought that no one would ever know. But any such illusions were shattered the day that Nathan the prophet strolled into the palace courts. And Nathan said, "King David, I'd like to tell you a story. It's about two men. Two men in a certain town. One was very rich and the other was very poor. The rich man had all kinds of cattle and sheep. The poor man only had one little lamb. But it was a very special little lamb. It ate the food from his table, drank from his cup, played with his children, slept in his arms. One day a visitor came to town. He did so to pay the rich man a visit. But instead of killing one of his own sheep or cattle, the rich man took that poor man's one little lamb, his only little lamb, and slaughtered it for a feast for his guests. When David heard those sort of details, he was incensed. And he responded to Nathan with these words, "As surely as the Lord lives, that man will pay for that lamb 4 times over." At which point the prophet pointed his finger directly at the king and said, "You are the man. You're the guy." Did you bring your Bible with you today? Let's head in the direction of 2 Samuel chapter 11, shall we? So we'll spend the bulk of our time. There's also some reference and material in chapter 12 as well, but predominantly in chapter 11. We'll be moving down through that text. We do make outlines available as you're entering the building. That's always an option. If you want to pick one of those up, you can fill in the blanks. Jot down additional references as I share those with you. Kind of track with me as we move through. We're winding down in this study, this sermon series we're calling A Heart Like His. And our focus over these days has revolved around the 7 qualities that made David's heart like God's. That made David's heart a heart like God's. To this point in our study, David's example has been purely positive, one to emulate. But all that changes this morning. Today we're going to learn from his mistakes. If you ask the average person what they remember about David, they're probably going to recall his greatest achievement and his greatest failure. We've already covered his incredible victory over Goliath very early on in this study. Today we'll examine his greatest failure, his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. Let me begin by responding to a question that's probably already surfaced in your thinking. The question probably goes something like this: how could David, the only individual who's been called a man after God's own heart, how could David, the guy who was so passionate about his relationship with the Lord, how could David, the man responsible for writing many of the Psalms we treasure, how could he fail so badly? I understand the sentiment. I've grappled with that question myself. But for the answer, I have to look no further than my own heart. I'm well aware of the desires, thoughts, and evil inclinations that surface in my own life that are so completely contrary to God's holiness. And I dare say that most of us are like David in this regard. We all have something in our past that we deeply regret. Something we're ashamed of, something that we're terribly embarrassed about. And so maybe the more pressing question this morning would be this: can God really forgive the likes of me? Is pardon before God actually possible in light of how badly I've blown it? That's what makes this account so relevant today. Quality number 6, David had a forgiven heart. And so this morning, if you're tracking with me on the outline, we're going to pick up on 4 warnings out of this passage, 4 warnings that David should have picked up on. And again, we're learning from his negative example, hopefully 4 warnings that we'll take very seriously today. The first one would be this. Warning number 1, never excuse sin. When we last left our hero, he was at the pinnacle of his career. God had granted him unbelievable success. Basically, the former shepherd boy had it all working for him: fame, fortune, power, position. And for a while, David handled the blessings of God with brilliant integrity. In fact, you can see it there, 2 Samuel 8:15. David reigned over Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. But it's important that we understand today that David's demise didn't happen overnight. Already some chinks had begun to form in his spiritual armor. If we look at 2 Samuel 5:12, David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. He knew that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. What's that tell us? David knew who was responsible for his success. He recognized that God's hand was on him. And yet, despite that knowledge, he ignored God's warning and recklessly pursued what he wanted to do. Case in point, 2 Samuel 5:13, after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. Here's the reality, gang. That was in direct contradiction to God's commands. Commands that are spelled out in a variety of places, but probably primarily in Deuteronomy 17. The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Deuteronomy 17 spells out the requirements for all future kings of Israel in no uncertain terms. I mean, stop and think about it. What part of don't take many wives isn't clear? What part don't you understand? It seems pretty obvious. God said it black and white. He stated there would be consequences, but apparently David thought, I can handle it. It's no big deal. I'm above the law. The Apostle Paul wrote these words in the New Testament for people like David. Don't be so naive and self-confident. You're not exempt. You could fall flat on your face as easily as anyone else. If you think somehow that you're above being tempted, if you have concluded that it could never happen to me, then you need to look out. Based on that passage, you need to look out because it's only a matter of time if that's your attitude. David failed to recognize that the passion of sex is not satisfied by many partners. Many partners only intensifies it. Having many women does not reduce a man's sex drive. It excites it. It stimulates it. It's like drinking salt water when you're out on the open seas. When you're stranded on the open seas, you start drinking salt water, and the more you drink attempting to quench your thirst, the more you crave until ultimately it kills you. David had grown accustomed to getting what he wanted. And perhaps the biggest snag that led to his downfall was that he had virtually no accountability in his life. Think about it. His entire track record was marked by nothing but success. A humble beginning, a giant killer, 2 decades of spotless leadership, choice men in the right places, a military force every foe respected, an enlarged kingdom of over 60,000 square miles, no defeats on the battlefield, a strong national defense, financial health, a beautiful new home, plans for the temple of the Lord. Who in their right mind could point a finger of accusation against such a king? So what if he wanted to marry a few extra women? So what if he privately increased the number of his concubines? Look at all the good he's done. And so it was only a matter of time until David's illicit desires undermined his integrity. Chuck Swindoll says it like this: at this point, David's life was like a neglected seawall standing constantly against the barrage of the tide and the waves and the ever-pounding sea. Unguarded and in a weakened moment, it crumbled at his feet, and he paid a terrible price. Take heed this morning, good friend. take heed. We are especially prone to sin when everything is going great. When you receive the big promotion, when everybody's pointing at your spotless record, when you're growing in popularity and everybody's telling you how great you are, look out, especially if you're not accountable to anybody. The Bible tells us over in Proverbs 16, first pride and then the crash. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. So we never excuse sin. We never dismiss it. We never say it's no big deal. Warning number 2, never excite sin. You have the text open there, 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1 begins this way. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war. Springtime marks the end of the rainy season in the Middle East. It assures that roads will be in good condition. There'll be plenty of fodder for war horses, and then an army on the march will be able to nourish themselves, to raid the fields for food. And so in the spring, at the time of year when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army, and they destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Scholars are divided on whether David should have been leading his troops on the battlefield here. You'll hear both arguments presented in the commentaries. This much we can say for sure. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? And so verse 2, one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. We're not told specifics, but more than likely because of the oppressive conditions of an unusually hot spring day, David extended his afternoon siesta into the cooler part of the evening. The king is restless here. He's delegated so much responsibility that he left himself open to boredom. What did your grandmother tell you about idle hands, right? And so he gets up from his bed to take a stroll. The roof in this case, don't think of our standard pitched roofs. It would be more like a balcony here. That he could walk very easily out on and take in the sights of the city. And as he does so, his eyes fall upon a woman who's also trying to escape the suffocating heat of her own house by bathing outside. And the scriptures tell us from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Rarely do the Hebrew scriptures use the word very. And so when they do so here, that's exactly what it means. In other words, she was va-va-va-va-voom, okay? That's literally how it reads there in the Hebrew. Again, the commentators are going to be divided here, but I don't. My take on this is not Bathsheba's fault. The responsibility lies with David. And at this point, he's confronted with a choice. He can stand there ogling, drooling until he loses control and caves in. Or he can get down off the roof, run a few laps, take a cold shower, and do whatever's necessary to get his mind off of her. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has a classic statement at this point in his book, Temptation. He writes this: in our members, there's a slumbering inclination toward desire, which is both sudden and fierce. With irresistible power, desire seizes mastery of the flesh. All at once, a secret smoldering fire is kindled. The flesh burns and is in flames. It makes no difference whether it's a sexual desire or ambition or vanity or desire for revenge, or love of fame and power or greed for money. At this moment, God is quite unreal to us. He loses all reality, and only desire for the creature is real. The only reality is the devil. Satan does not here fill us with hatred of God, but with forgetfulness of God. You see what he's saying there, right? The forbidden fruit. Whatever that happens to be in our particular temptation, the forbidden fruit looms so large before us. That's all we can see. That's all we can focus on. It consumes us, and in the process, it obscures God out of the equation. At this point, it's critical to follow the battle strategy of Barney Fife. We need to nip it in the bud. Not very often that you can quote both Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Barney Fife in the same sermon, okay? So if it works out, you got to make it happen. David chose not to nip it. He chose to instead throw gas on the proverbial fire. He begins to fantasize about her. He wanted that woman, and he wanted her now. Hear me this morning, good friend. The Bible is specifically clear at this point. There's something so strong about sexual desire, about sexual temptation, that our only recourse is to lace up our Nikes and get out of there. Let me show you what I mean. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. 2 Timothy 2:22, flee the evil desires of youth. One more, Proverbs 4, do not set foot on the path of the wicked or walk in the way of evil men. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn from it and go on your way. Seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? Don't go near. Don't go near. Invest in an internet filter. Ditch the movie stations. Don't climb in the back seat of the car. Avoid that person of the opposite sex who is not your spouse that you're attracted to. There's a word for those who stand around thinking they're strong enough to handle it. They're called victims. If you do not run, the odds are you will fall. It's only a matter of time. So we don't excuse sin. We definitely don't excite it. Warning number 3, never explore sin. Check it out. You saw it in verse 2. David saw, right? He saw the beautiful woman bathing. Now verse 3 begins, and David sent. David sent someone to find out about her. And so here the king is thinking, I need to check this out. I need to investigate this. I need to learn more. I wonder if she's on Facebook. And notice what the servant responds. The man said, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Anyone that's thinking clearly here can hear the subtle warning. While it was customary to name a person's father and grandfather, occasionally maybe even a great-grandfather, you typically didn't mention their spouse. And so without outright confronting his master, this servant is hoping that David is going to pick up on his signal. She's married. She doesn't belong to you. She's off limits. She belongs to another man. The servant knew exactly what David was thinking. The servant was a man. He could see Bathsheba's beauty. He knew his master. He'd seen the harem. But it doesn't even register here with David. At this point, the king has it all mapped out in his mind. Deep down, David knew exactly how he wanted this thing to play out. Here's how the Apostle James describes it in the New Testament. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he's dragged away and enticed. Can you see it there? It's our own evil desires, isn't it? It's our own evil desires that lead us into deeper trouble. When it comes to resisting temptation, we've talked about this on other occasions, but the battlefield is right here between our ears. The battlefield is our brain, our mind. We must cautiously guard what our minds are exposed to. And we all know that the problem is we live in a hyper-sexualized culture. I don't think I have to convince you of that today. But just a few stats here real quickly. We won't belabor this, but over 40 million Americans regularly view pornography. Human trafficking is a global epidemic with over 45 million people enslaved around the world. Premarital sex is the rule, not the exception in the United States. Studies show that by age 20, 75% of Americans have had premarital sex. That number rises to 95% by age 44. Sex outside of any kind of committed relationship is not only in high demand. For example, upwards of 80% of college students have engaged in some form of uncommitted sexual behavior. And apparently, it's now just a swipe away. Dating apps have created an incredibly easy marketplace to hook up for casual sex. I could give you more, but you don't need that information. You're aware of it. You get the picture. The point is, we need to guard our thought life. That is absolutely critical, what we're taking in. And so the prayer, Psalm 139, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Experienced downhill skiers are conscious of what is called the fall line. It's that point where the tips of their skis are pointed downhill, and gravity takes over so that you lose control. It's too late. You can't pull back. You're past the point of no return. The fall line. Life is a lot like skiing. The pace is fast, the surface is slick, the terrain is rough, and the challenges to maintain control are many. Believers, like skiers, must be aware at all times of the fall line and how quickly we can find ourselves hurling down a slippery slope. Again, the reality is it can happen to any one of us. And so we're not going to excuse sin. We're not going to excite sin. We're not going to explore sin. And warning number 4, never evade sin. When we're confronted with the sin in our life, when we realize what we've done, we come clean. We don't ignore it. We don't pretend like it's not an issue. We don't evade it. We come clean. Verse 4 mercifully tells the story in the briefest possible details. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. So David saw, David sent, and David slept, didn't he? The man who had everything did not have enough. Proverbs 9:17, stolen waters are sweet. We have no reason to believe not to believe that both David and Bathsheba thoroughly enjoyed themselves. He was romantic and handsome. She was lonely, beautiful, and flattered. So undoubtedly both enjoyed it. The Bible describes sin as pleasurable, doesn't it? And there can be little question, sin is fun for a season. But it carries a huge price tag, and eventually it catches up with you. And of course, the devil never tells you, Satan never tells you the consequences going into the situation. He shows you the beauty and the ecstasy and the excitement. And so he never tells the heavy drinker about tomorrow's hangover. He doesn't tell the promiscuous teen that pregnancy is a possibility or you could get a life-threatening STD. He doesn't let on to the adulterer, you're going to tear your family apart. Are you kidding? None of that is mentioned. And then when the bill for that sin comes due, the devil's nowhere to be found. And that's why we need to contemplate the results. That's why we need to remind ourselves to look down the road and ask, where's this path going to take me? Where's this thing going to end? For David and Bathsheba, they committed adultery. She went home. Time passed. She realized she was pregnant. And when David heard the news, he had a decision to make. He could go before God and declare himself completely contaminated and guilty, or he could go the route of deception and hypocrisy. You know which way it went. Sadly, David chose the latter, which led him even into further sin. You see, when consumed by panic, we don't make wise decisions, do we? We make dumb decisions. And that's where David is. Most of you know what happened next. David tries to cover his tracks. He sends for Bathsheba's husband Uriah so he would have intercourse with her and thus think the baby was his. But Uriah's honor spoiled his plan. He refused to go home while his fellow soldiers are on the field. David could steal the man's wife, but he couldn't manipulate the woman's husband. And so now, in even greater panic, he escalates the plot to the next level. The king gave orders to Uriah to deliver to General Joab, and Uriah trustingly carries his own death warrant to his executioner. The insidious plan was to put Uriah on the front line and then pull the troops back so that he would most certainly be killed in the battle. The plan worked to perfection. David waited for the appropriate period for Bathsheba's mourning to be over, and then he added her to his stable of wives, and she bore him a son. No man's an island. When we deliberately sin, we begin a series of ripple effects that often escalate wildly out of control. So stop and think about it here for just a second. David involved a servant in his plan. He seduced Bathsheba. He incorporates Joab in his sin when he had Uriah killed. Other innocent soldiers died on the battlefield that day in the cover-up effort. But most importantly here, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And so in that brief statement, we see the raw, open sewage of David's life. Are you keeping score at home? Lust, adultery, hypocrisy, murder. How could a man after God's own heart fall to such a level? Sadly, David had quenched the Spirit to such a degree that he was able to resist the conviction of the Spirit repeatedly. And I don't know, I think little should frighten us more. Little should frighten us more than realizing that the Holy Spirit's conviction can grow so faint that we no longer hear it. We no longer sense it. What a precarious spiritual position to be in, right? The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews would later write, so as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Don't harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. We never want to get to that place where we no longer sense the convicting power of God's Holy Spirit. Fortunately for David, though he had drifted far from God, he hadn't severed all contact. And so ultimately, when Nathan the prophet was sent by God to confront David, he uses 4 3-letter words that did the job. You are the man. Silence filled the room. The king was cut to the heart. And he says the one thing that's most appropriate. I have sinned. I have sinned against the Lord. With that admission, the restoration process began. And we don't read it in this section of 2 Samuel, but it's clear from other passages that it's been 9 to 12 months that have elapsed. 9 to 12, well, maybe up to a year that has gone by, and the sin is still unconfessed in David's heart. But during that time, here's the point, during that year, David is miserable. Look at Psalm 32. There was a time when I wouldn't admit what a sinner I was, but my dishonesty made me miserable and filled my days with frustration. All day, all night, your heavy hand was on me. My strength evaporated like water on a sunny day until finally I admitted all my sins to you and stopped trying to hide them. I said, I will confess them to the Lord. And you forgave me. All my guilt is gone. Take special note of that last part. When we confess our sins to God, no matter what we've done, He will forgive. He will take our guilt away. David, no doubt, composed Psalm 32 shortly after his encounter with the prophet Nathan. And the same would hold true for Psalm 51, probably composed again shortly after Nathan confronted him. David writes there, "You would not be pleased with sacrifices, or I would bring them. If I brought you a burnt offering, you would not accept it. The sacrifice you want is a broken spirit, a broken and repentant heart. O God, you will not despise." We cannot earn our way back into God's favor through works, through our human efforts. The key is to confess. The key is to acknowledge before God that we have sinned. We must approach Him with a broken, contrite heart in order to receive the grace He wants to give. Let's go back to that question that I asked at the beginning of the message today. Can God really forgive the likes of me? It's a question that Jesus was responding to in one of his most famous stories. It centered around a rebellious young man who wasted his inheritance, squandered it on fast women and wild living until finally it was gone, and he found himself subsisting on pig food. And the text tells us that he finally came to his senses. He came to his senses and he determined, I need to go home. I need to see my dad. And all the way home, he rehearsed that confession, didn't he? Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. Father, I've sinned against heaven. All the way home, he's rehearsing this speech and what he's going to say. Now, here's the good part. While he was still a long ways off, his father saw him. The text doesn't tell us, but you get the impression that Dad probably wandered to the end of the driveway at least once a day, maybe several times a day. And when he did, he scanned the horizon looking for a familiar figure. And then one day he saw him. And how did he respond? Text tells us he was filled with compassion. Back that up for me one slide. He was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son and threw his arms around him. Men in this culture didn't run for anything. It was beneath their dignity. This dad did. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And as the son begins to launch into that rehearsed speech, his father, he didn't even get a chance to get all the way through. And this is what his dad said: quick, bring the best robe and put it on, and put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. You want to know whether God can forgive the likes of you? You want to know whether God can pardon you based on how badly you've blown it? There's the word picture in Luke 15. You've got a dad who's looking for you to come home. And he wants to throw his arms around you and kiss you and celebrate and throw a party. His grace, His mercy is available for you today, no matter what you've done, no matter how many times you've done it. Appropriate way to end the service today, it's a chorus that's been around forever. If I was singing it as a kid, it's been around forever, okay? But it's based on Psalm 51, right out of the text, Psalm 51, and it's an appropriate way to express our sentiments before God. Just this before we close. If you have questions, concerns about what we've discussed today, there's something I can help you with, encourage, pray with you. Don't be afraid to reach out. Contact me, let me know. Be more than happy to do whatever I can to support you. Let's stand. Let's express this as a prayer before God.